Deep within the industrial landscape of the American Eastern Seaboard, a colossal financial illusion took shape inside rusting metal cylinders. 51 major financial institutions, including some of the most prestigious banks on Wall Street, poured hundreds of millions of dollars into a seemingly safe, tangible asset. They believed they were financing a mountain of liquid gold secured by ironclad guarantees and rigorous inspections. Instead, they were funding an empire built on saltwater shadows and a breathtaking manipulation of institutional trust. The epicenter of this deception was Bayonne, New Jersey, a gritty port city bristling with refineries and storage facilities. Here, the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation established a sprawling footprint in the late 1950s. The company positioned itself as a dominant force in the global commodities market, exporting vast quantities of shortening and cooking oils to a hungry post-war world. The sheer scale of the operation, with its endless rows of massive storage tanks, projected an aura of unassailable industrial strength. The architect of this massive enterprise was Anthony De Angelis, known to associates as Tino, a former meatpacker with a checkered financial history. De Angelis possessed an uncanny ability to exploit regulatory blind spots and charm seasoned financiers. He understood that in the high-stakes world of commodities trading, the perception of immense physical inventory was just as powerful as the inventory itself. His ambition was not merely to dominate the export market, but to monopolize the very financial instruments that fueled it. To finance his aggressive expansion, De Angelis utilized a standard financial practice known as field warehousing. In this system, a borrower stores commodities in a secure facility managed by an independent third party. This third party issues warehouse receipts, which certify the exact quantity and quality of the stored goods. These receipts act as a powerful form of collateral, allowing the borrower to secure massive cash loans from banks and brokerage houses. It is a system entirely dependent on the absolute integrity of the physical verification process. Recognizing the need for a gold-plated guarantor, Allied Crude brought in American Express Field Warehousing, a newly formed subsidiary of the legendary financial services giant. The mere presence of the American Express name acted as a psychological shield, instantly disarming the natural skepticism of Wall Street lenders. Bankers assumed that a corporation with such a pristine global reputation would implement impenetrable security protocols. They failed to realize that the subsidiary was woefully unprepared for the sheer logistical nightmare of the Bayonne facility. The tank farm was a labyrinth of interconnected pipes, valves, and towering metal silos. Verifying the contents of these tanks was a dangerous, dirty, and physically demanding job. Inspectors had to climb to the top of structures holding millions of gallons of liquid, drop a measuring tape, and pull up a sample to confirm the presence of the specified commodity. De Angelis knew that human nature naturally gravitates toward the path of least resistance, especially in a hazardous industrial environment. Exploiting this human vulnerability, the perpetrators devised a brilliantly simple method of deception. Because oil naturally floats on top of water, Allied Crude filled the massive storage tanks almost entirely with seawater. They then pumped a thin layer of genuine vegetable oil onto the surface. When inspectors dropped their measuring lines from the top hatches, the tape passed through the genuine oil, registering a full tank of valuable commodity. The illusion was perfect, physically verifiable, and utterly fraudulent. The deception extended far beyond simple physics. The facility featured a complex network of hidden pipes and false compartments. When inspectors demanded to test multiple tanks simultaneously, workers secretly pumped the same small batch of genuine oil from one tank to another, staying just one step ahead of the auditing team. Furthermore, the custodians hired by American Express Field Warehousing to guard the facility were often former employees of Allied Crude, creating a catastrophic conflict of interest that compromised the entire security apparatus. Armed with forged and fraudulently obtained warehouse receipts, De Angelis approached the financial markets with an insatiable appetite for capital. He borrowed staggering sums, using the phantom inventory as collateral. The funds were not used to build a legitimate business, but rather to finance a massive, highly leveraged gamble on the commodities futures market. He began buying up soybean oil futures in a desperate attempt to corner the market, artificially inflating prices to sustain the illusion of his company's immense profitability. The financial institutions, blinded by the lucrative interest rates and the perceived safety of the American Express guarantee, abandoned their standard risk assessment protocols. They eagerly accepted the warehouse receipts without ever sending their own independent auditors to the New Jersey waterfront. The promise of steady, high-yield returns created a collective delusion on Wall Street. The banks were not merely victims of a cunning swindle. Their own institutional greed made them unwitting accomplices in their financial destruction. By the autumn of 1963, the house of cards had reached unprecedented heights. Allied Crude had amassed a staggering position in the commodities market, holding futures contracts that far exceeded the actual physical supply of soybean oil in the entire United States. The company's debt had ballooned to roughly $175 million, backed by warehouse receipts for nearly 2 billion pounds of salad oil. The global financial system was tethered to a commodity that simply did not exist. The inevitable collapse was triggered not by a vigilant inspector, but by the ruthless efficiency of the free market. In mid-November, the price of soybean oil futures suddenly plummeted. The market had realized that the anticipated export demand, particularly from the Soviet Union, was not going to materialize. As the value of the contracts cratered, the brokerage firms that had facilitated the massive trades issued immediate margin calls, demanding that Allied Crude deposit millions of dollars in cash to cover the mounting losses. The Phantom Empire could not produce real cash. De Angelis was entirely out of capital, his funds locked in worthless futures contracts, and the maintenance of his elaborate deception. When Allied Crude failed to meet the margin calls, the brokerage firms attempted to liquidate the collateral. They presented the warehouse receipts to American Express field warehousing, demanding the physical delivery of the millions of gallons of oil that supposedly secured the catastrophic debt. The true scale of the disaster was finally revealed when independent auditors descended upon the Bayonne facility. As they began to drain the tanks, the horrifying reality emerged. The massive silos, which were supposed to contain enough oil to supply the nation for months, yielded nothing but millions of gallons of polluted seawater. The complex network of pipes, the false bottoms, and the compromised inspectors were all dragged into the harsh light of a federal investigation. The revelation triggered a financial earthquake. Two major Wall Street brokerage firms, Ira Haupt and Company and J.R. Williston and Bean, were instantly pushed to the brink of insolvency, unable to absorb the massive losses from the worthless collateral. The New York Stock Exchange faced the very real threat of a systemic panic, forcing the exchange to take unprecedented emergency measures to protect the accounts of thousands of innocent retail investors who had been caught in the crossfire. The crisis exposed the terrifying interconnectedness of the modern financial system. A single fraudulent operation in a New Jersey port had managed to compromise international banks, elite brokerage houses, and a global credit institution. The American Express company saw its stock price plummet as it faced hundreds of millions of dollars in liability claims. The firm was forced to assume a massive financial burden to preserve its reputation and prevent a wider collapse of the international warehousing industry. Investigators meticulously dismantled the mechanics of the Great Salad Oil Swindle. They documented how basic scientific principles like the buoyancy of oil were weaponized against sophisticated financial models. They traced the flow of forged documents and uncovered the extensive bribery that kept the facility's workforce silent. The forensic accounting revealed a labyrinth of shell companies and falsified ledgers, demonstrating how entirely fictitious assets were transformed into hard currency through the exploitation of institutional trust. The legal reckoning was swift and severe. Tino De Angelis was indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and forgery. The subsequent trials exposed the staggering audacity of his methods and the catastrophic failure of oversight by the lenders. De Angelis was ultimately convicted and sentenced to a lengthy federal prison term, his name forever etched in the annals of white-collar crime, as the architect of one of the most destructive inventory frauds in American history. The timing of the collapse added a profound layer of historical trauma. The crisis reached its absolute peak on November 22, 1963, the very day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. As the nation plunged into mourning, the financial markets were simultaneously wrestling with the unraveling of the massive swindle. The convergence of these two events created an atmosphere of profound instability, testing the resilience of the American economic system during one of its darkest hours. The legacy of the disaster forced a complete overhaul of collateral lending practices. The scandal demonstrated that paper guarantees, no matter how prestigious the issuing institution, were entirely worthless without rigorous, independent physical verification. Regulators and financial institutions implemented strict new protocols for auditing field warehouses, mandating surprise inspections, advanced measurement techniques, and the absolute separation of auditing personnel from the facility's daily operations. The disaster became a foundational case study in corporate risk management. It highlighted the devastating consequences of siloed information, where the financial risk officers in Manhattan were completely disconnected from the physical reality on the docks of New Jersey. Modern auditing standards now demand a holistic approach, requiring financial analysts to maintain a deep, practical understanding of the underlying assets they are financing, rather than relying blindly on third-party certifications. While the major financial institutions eventually absorbed the staggering financial blow, the broader economic impact was profound. The cost of the fraud was ultimately passed down through the system, resulting in tighter credit markets, increased insurance premiums, and a chilling effect on commodities financing that lasted for years. The sheer scale of the capital destruction served as a grim reminder that white-collar crime is never a victimless offense, regardless of whether the immediate targets are massive corporations. The psychological lessons of the swindle remain fiercely relevant. The perpetrators successfully weaponized the halo effect, using the sterling reputation of American Express to blind seasoned professionals to obvious logistical impossibilities. It is a stark warning that prestige and corporate branding can act as powerful cognitive biases, overriding critical thinking and basic common sense. The illusion of authority often serves as the most effective camouflage for systemic deception. Today, the mechanics of inventory fraud have evolved from physical tanks of salt water to manipulated databases and phantom digital assets. While the tools have changed, the underlying vulnerabilities remain identical. Modern supply chains are increasingly complex, spanning multiple continents and relying on intricate digital tracking systems. The risk of sophisticated actors fabricating digital warehouse receipts or manipulating blockchain ledgers presents a contemporary parallel to the forged paperwork that once flooded Wall Street. Defending against these modern iterations requires a synthesis of technological innovation and fundamental skepticism. Advanced supply chain verification now utilizes satellite imagery, drone inspections, and real-time sensor data to confirm the physical existence of assets. However, as the historical precedent proves, technology alone is insufficient. Robust defense requires a culture of relentless inquiry, where auditors are empowered to challenge assumptions, verify anomalies, and look beneath the surface of seemingly perfect data. Ultimately, the collapse of Allied Crude exposes an enduring flaw in the architecture of high finance. The persistent desire for outsized returns frequently overrides the mandate for rigorous due diligence. Whenever capital flows too freely toward an asset class that defies independent verification, the conditions for a catastrophic swindle are present. The phantom promises of the past continue to echo through modern financial crises, driven by the same fundamental human vulnerabilities. The empty tanks of Bayonne stand as a permanent monument to the dangers of unchecked ambition and institutional complacency. The Great Salad Oil Swindle proves that the most devastating frauds are often built on the simplest of illusions, requiring only a willing suspension of disbelief to succeed. True financial security demands unwavering vigilance, a commitment to verifying the tangible reality behind every paper promise, and the courage to question the impossible. New stories weekly. Stay one step ahead of the fraud. Subscribe.